now to our guest today, Andy. He's a professor both at the GSB and in political science. And yeah, he's been a co-director of CPER and the Center for Polarization Research, Polarization Lab. And also he'll be teaching a course next quarter on DAOs, but like blockchain governments more generally, which will be cross-listed across a whole bunch of different schools for probably the first time ever. So yeah, he'll be telling you a little bit more about that as well. And you can see his website. But yeah, I'll let you take it away.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, just to briefly, before I get into my material, we are teaching a new class on blockchain governance, mostly about DAOs, how they work, practical questions about DAOs, view from social science, a view from law, as well as how to actually build them. And so this will be co-taught between me, coming from the business school, which is why it's a GSB listed class, Dan Bonet in the CS department, and Jeff Stranaud in the law school. So it'll be a pretty cool, exciting kind of like cross-Stanford class about blockchain governance, and I hope people will take it. And yeah, don't hesitate to email me if you have any questions about it. It's supposed to be open to everyone, no prereqs. Should be super fun. Cool. Okay, I'm going to dive in. Please interrupt me at any time if anything's not clear or if you just have questions. I purposefully made the number of slides pretty small. I'm usually a pretty succinct person. I'm relatively confident I'll get through everything, so please don't hesitate to interrupt at any time. And I gather there's a mic you can use if you want to be on the video. Cool, okay. Just to get disclosures out of the way, I get consulting income from A16Z Crypto and Meta, which is relevant for some of what I'm going to talk about. And what I want to talk about today is governance. So my background, as we just said, is from political science. I've historically mostly studied how you design constitutions, systems of government for the real world. But over the last 5 years, I've spent more and more of my time in the digital world trying to understand how we could write constitutions or design systems of governance for different kinds of online communities or platforms. And so when I say governance, what I mean is the system that determines who has the power to make decisions and the process by which they make those decisions. It's really central to a lot of human society to decide how you're going to do those things, and it affects kind of everything. And the point I want to make, just to motivate everything I'm going to talk about today, is that Web3 or crypto, a lot of the motivation, essentially all of the motivation, has something to do with governance, right? If you look at what people say about Web3 and blockchain, the whole point is it's supposed to be the system for making strong commitments. This idea, like as Tim Roughgarden puts it, right, a computer in the sky that no one owns. And you can use that computer to make commitments to one another. You can create property rights, strong enforceable contracts, and so forth. And the whole justification for why we're interested in that has something to do with this idea of distributing out power or decentralizing power, whatever you want to call it. And so it really is about governance. And if we can get governance to work well, then I think there's a huge amount of promise in this whole space. But of course, what we've seen to date is that getting governance to work well is actually super, super hard. And we all know that from our own experience in the real world. It's very hard to point to anywhere in the real world where you're like, yeah, it's super easy to solve that collective choice problem, right? Some societies, some cities, some countries, some clubs seem to be better at it than others, but it's super, super hard everywhere. And so it shouldn't be that surprising that we're still in the early stages of figuring this out for Web3 too. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about today, is what we've seen so far in terms of governance in Web3, what some of the key problems are, some examples of how different projects are dealing with this, and so forth. And I'm going to be drawing largely here, I'll say, from my experience working with a bunch of different DAO projects, trying to understand their governance problems, and trying to draw analogies from what I've seen in the physical world to design new ways of doing governance for Web3. Okay, so let me just, on that point, just tell you very quickly something I'm sure you probably all already have a sense of, which is that what's going on in crypto and on the internet more generally is a very interesting and a logical extension of what's come before. So sometimes you'll see rhetoric about how this is all super new and different, and in some ways, of course, it is, but it's also worth reflecting on and thinking about the fact that we can probably learn a lot from what's happened before, because a lot of the same challenges and problems have come up. So let me give you 30 seconds of background on corporate governance and 30 seconds of backgrounds on democracy. There's a lot of other people on campus you could go very deep on these topics with. Corporate governance, okay? We start out maybe 600, 700 years ago. People want to invest in projects. They want to launch a ship to go somewhere or something and maybe find something worth money, okay? At first, maybe you're one investor. You fund the whole thing yourself. You pay attention to it. It goes well, whatever. Then over time, you're like, maybe I should invest in a bunch of these. And then a bunch of other people are like, I should also invest in these. Now suddenly you each have a portfolio of these investments, and you can't spend all your time monitoring it, right? You're invested in a bunch of things, so are a lot of other people. You start to think, I'm too busy, and also I'm just one of 100 people who invested in this thing. Why should I pay any attention to it? And things start to go wrong. People's money gets stolen. Might sound familiar. Some things we've heard about here recently. So what do? Well, we invent this whole apparatus to monitor the investments and to try to make them go well and to prevent theft and to prevent other kinds of mistakes. And what does that structure look like? Well, we have shareholders that vote on things, but we don't expect shareholders to vote on everything because it's too hard to ask them to vote on everything. They don't show up to do it. They don't know what they need to know to do it. And they're just one of hundreds or thousands of shareholders, so why should they learn? So what do we do instead? We have a board. We have a board of a small number of people who are paid to monitor on our behalf, to be our agents monitoring this corporation. That's the core insight to some extent of corporate governance. There's a lot of other things too, but that's like a really key part of it. The idea that we elect a board that represents us as shareholders to monitor the investment. That's exactly what we see to some extent going on in DAOs today. Right? We have this sort of like the exact same idea that when there were just a couple of us, we could kind of vote on everything. And then DAOs started to get bigger and more people entered them. And it started to become impractical really, really quickly. And we started to see a lot of things go wrong. And now, one of the things you'll see a lot in the DAO space, right, is people saying, maybe there should be a council, or maybe there should be a group of delegates that oversee these things for us on a regular basis, and maybe we should pay them. And so I just want to point out there's a lot of parallels here to corporate governance. Obviously, there's also a lot of parallels to democracy. The exact same kind of thing happened in democracy. When it's 10 or 15 people in a settlement together, you can kind of talk everything out and just figure it out. And then as it starts to scale, it gets harder to do that. And you might have a similar calculus to what I described with corporate governance. Why should I pay attention to everything? I have other stuff I have to do, and there's 500 people here. Can't some of them do it? I'm not going to weigh in. It wouldn't matter if I did anyways. I'm just one person. Right? And so democracy goes through the exact same type of evolution prior to corporate governance. And they come up with a similar set of solutions. And this is where corporate governance got a lot of their ideas from, right? We started electing representatives whose full-time job it was to monitor the goings-on of government on our behalf and to steer it in directions we want it to go in. Obviously, it doesn't work smoothly all the time, maybe an understatement, but it's a lot better than the alternative, which is so-called direct democracy, which you won't see any society on Earth use for any sustainable amount of time because it simply doesn't work. And that's what DAOs are figuring out right now. They've already pretty much figured it out, right? It just doesn't work. So what can you do instead? That's what I want to talk about today is like, what are DAOs doing? How does it borrow from these histories, but how is it new and different? And I just want to say as a political scientist, it's a crazy exciting time because there really should be something new here. The technology really is different. So we're not going to completely reinvent the wheel. There's a lot we can borrow, but there are new things here that are different, right? We can vote in different ways. We can assign out power in different ways. We can meet on different frequencies. We can make different types of decisions thanks to technology. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. The way I want to structure this talk is kind of along the lines of the meetings that I have with projects, so that if you're thinking of starting a project, you're thinking of working with a project, hopefully like this will be right on point for the kinds of things you should be thinking about. And I kind of want to organize that whole thing around one question, which is when you, let's say, want to build a DAO, what do you want governance to do for you? And the reason I want to frame it this way is sometimes we have this tendency in life, it's just natural in a lot of domains, to start with the tool and then decide what it's for. And this definitely happens sometimes in Web3. I'm sure we've all experienced this at some point, right? And so someone might just say, I need to have governance. I don't know why, but it's like a cool thing in Web3, and so I need it. And obviously that is not the way to figure out exactly how to design something for success. And so what you really want to do is start with what is the goal you're trying to solve. because depending on that goal, you might actually arrive at different structures, right? And so that's why it's not always useful. Sometimes you'll see blog posts or tweets in this space that are kind of like, this is the way governance should work. It should be all token voting. It should be no token voting. Those both could be right answers for different use cases. And so you have to start with the motivation. What are you trying to accomplish with your governance structure? There's surely a lot of potential answers to that, and I don't want to pretend to have all of them or even most of them. So I'm just going to hit on 3 possible justifications for DAO governance that I have seen come up and that I think also make sense, but this is not meant to be an exhaustive list. But those 3 things that I'm going to go through in some detail are, you might want to set up decentralized governance so that your protocol is censorship resistant, so that there's no single point of failure or single person or entity that can be gone after in various ways. You might want to do it to create user demand. Sometimes we see these cases where people are actually very excited about the chance to be part of a project that is collectively governed. So that's like a completely different motivation from the first. And the third is this broader idea of sort of like using it to build trust, right? If this is a long run project, you want people to build on top of your protocol. You want people to come and work with you, partner with you in different ways. To be able to say this is governed by the community might be helpful in creating those partnerships and in building that long-run trust. So those are 3 common motivations I see, all of which draw on historical experiences and research that I'll talk a little bit about. Obviously, there are downsides to building out governance in a democratic way for any of these, right? And so democracy as a general thing is an incredibly powerful tool. It's also like a super blunt instrument with a lot of downsides, right? So we know, we've probably all experienced it in various ways. It's slow, it's prone to conflict, if participation is low, it's very prone to interest group capture, which we see in DAO governance from time to time, and so forth. You would never design a smartphone through a democratic process, right? And so the question is, where do you want to use this incredibly powerful but incredibly complicated tool? You don't want to use it everywhere, right? No one uses it everywhere. You want to use it where where the value to using it far exceeds these costs. So that's what we're going to think about. Okay, so I'm going to run through these 3 goals and tell you a little bit about why they make sense and give you some examples of projects that I think fit these goals in different ways. Okay, so the first one is this very popular phrase, resisting censorship, right? It could mean a lot of different things, but the basic idea is that, right, a big promise of Web3 is that you can create these long-lived protocols and no one can mess with them in some sense, right? And so some of that is baked in, a lot of that perhaps, is baked into blockchain, and you don't need to add governance to your project to enjoy the benefits that are just baked into blockchain, right? The immutability and so forth. However, it's basically impossible, as far as I know, maybe someone can tell me otherwise. As far as I can see, there is essentially no important protocol or open source software project more generally where there's never any new decision that has to be made, right? The world at a minimum, the world changes and you have to decide something about how to update the protocol or change it in some way. But then there's a much broader set of things that also tends to happen. It tends to be that there need to be strategic decisions made. What's the future vision of this project? Sometimes revenue comes in. What are you going to do with the treasury? Those are all governance decisions that go beyond something that can be just ossified and made unchanging, right? And so that's where governance comes in, where decisions have to be made. And what people have discovered over time in Web3 is that that could be an area where using the tools of democracy is valuable if you want to remain in this sort of like censorship-resistant world and you want to be able to say, this is a democratically governed project, right? Anonymous entities anywhere in the world can join this project and be part of its governance. No one is in charge. And that can be quite valuable for some projects, and that's a tool that's something that democracy might be able to help us with. However, to do that, obviously, democracy has to work. Okay, and one of the challenges here that we've seen so far, which is completely unsurprising if you've spent time in other types of democratic systems, is that it's hard to get people to participate. So this is some data from a project that we're working on here at Stanford with Dan Bonet and two CS students here, where we're putting together all of the voting data from DAOs that are on Ethereum. And so this is preliminary. I want to stress we're not done with the project yet. Eventually it'll be a live dashboard that you can check out if you want. But what's already emerging from this data is exactly what we already know from experience in the space, which is that it's hard to get people to vote and most people don't vote. So what I'm showing you here, these bars, are of all the tokens outstanding in each of these DAOs, how many on average are used to vote on any given proposal in the DAO. And even those like wide bars at the top, which are complete outliers, and actually projects I'm not personally familiar with, even those wide bars out there are under 30%. Which is significantly worse than basically any major democracy in the physical world, even though we often complain about low turnout in the physical world. And you'll see most of them are like rounding errors. I played with different, we could have used logs or something, but I just want to kind of make it clear that the levels here are really small. And major projects are way at the bottom here, right? Maker, I mean, that's a huge deal. Tiny voting rate. And so if very few people are voting, that has a lot of potential downsides. And so like for one thing, you know, in terms of aggregating information to make the best possible decision by voting, it's obviously bad if the vast majority of people aren't voting. And of course it makes it harder to sustain the idea that this is a collectively governed entity and not something that's managed by a small number of people. And so for a wide variety of reasons, this has become an important area of study. Like how do we get participation to go up? Okay. So I want to talk about a specific example of this and some of the interesting things that are going on with it. So Maker, you know, one of the very largest DAOs by TVL, one of the oldest DAOs, one of the most creative with its governance, in many ways an inspiration for the space in general. Also the first special place in my heart, it was the first DAO that I sort of spent time studying and hanging out with. And it's a super interesting organization that's done a lot of really thoughtful things on governance. So what have they done over time in this vein of resisting censorship? Well, they started out in a way a lot of projects now start out. They were one of the first to explore this model, right? Like first they had a foundation, and the foundation kind of directed things and paid people and got things done. And then over time, as it sort of took off, they dissolved the foundation, right? And there now isn't a foundation. And things in some genuine sense are driven by the community. And they had this super interesting model, which they're now changing in kind of interesting ways, around what they called core units, right? And so people could come along, hopefully, this is the optimistic description, find a need that the project had that wasn't being fulfilled, propose a new core unit of people to fulfill that need, to work on it, and a budget, how much they would need to be paid to do that, and get approved and actually go do it. And so in some sense, the community really did drive the bus and still is today. However, right, there's been a bunch of challenges to that. And so Maker has really like, almost every challenge we see in DAO governance today, Maker has already seen before. And that's why it's such an interesting and important project. And so what are some of the problems? Well, when you create a super decentralized process where anyone can come and form a team and propose to get funded, it's very natural, whether or not the money is being spent prudently, it's just natural for people to start worrying that it's not. Because you're not around all the time, you don't feel it, and you start to worry that sort of like a lot of waste is going on. And so one of the things that the Maker community has really battled over is sort of like, is all this spending justified, or are we burning our money? And should we have fewer core units? And that's been a big debate that's been going on. The second thing, which goes back to that graph, is that they're very aware, right, that the participation rates are low. And they've explored some, I think, really smart ways to try to improve it. And so one thing they've been out in front on is creating an official program of delegation, right? So they recognize that basically direct democracy is not practical for the reasons I said before. So let's have delegates and let's pay them. And the Maker delegates get paid quite a significant amount of money to be sort of like full-time governance experts, if you will. And so that might help with the participation problem. Of course, you still need to get the average user to pay enough attention to delegate, which is its own challenge, but it seems like a step in the right direction. Another thing they've explored, and which I've done some research on, I just want to mention briefly, is another thing you could do, taking advantage of like the token structure, is actually provide direct rewards for voting. And that's something that more projects are now exploring in the space. and something I'm really interested in studying. So we proposed a particular mechanism to set the price at which you reward people to vote, and some projects are trying to implement that, and I'm super curious to see if it'll work. It seems like something at least worth trying, given that we would like to get the participation rates up. Okay, the second purpose is to stimulate user demand, is to get people excited, right? There's a wide range of applications where to be able to say to people, if you come and join this community or you buy this token or whatever, you get to be a participant, a contributor to the decisions we make as a collective. That can be very appealing to people. Of course, the counter argument, right? I mean, there's two counter arguments. One would be what I said before, that it's hard to participate and people don't like it all the time. Sometimes they just want to enjoy the service. And the second counter argument would be, there can be lip service paid to this idea that you're part of the community. But if you're only one vote among many, what contribution you're really making? And so there's a challenge here in terms of getting this right and making people genuinely feel bought into the community. But if you can do it, I think it can be a very powerful phenomenon, and we've seen that in quite a few projects, where you kind of create this governance flywheel, by which I mean some people start this thing, maybe it's a group of friends or people who've met each other online in various ways, right? And they get really into it, and they create a system that makes new people want to join. And those people join and discover, wow, it is fun to actually be part of the decision-making process. And then they come up with new stuff to do. Maybe they fund some new projects that make the community even more appealing, and then more people want to come in and do the same thing, and you kind of rinse and repeat that, right? And that's a thing that a lot of people are trying to achieve through governance, but it's very nuanced. It's hard to get that off the ground. Sometimes it seems to happen by pure luck. How can you bottle that and repeat it is a big question, I think, in DAO governance. Perhaps the most famous example of this is nouns, right? Where it's in some sense, this arbitrary thing where each day you have the opportunity to bid in an auction for a noun. If you win it, you become a voting member of this thing. One noun is, it comes out each day. And very early on, it sort of created this really cool snowball effect where people were like, this is a really cool community. I want to be part of this. And then the flywheel really started to spin because the nouns became quite expensive, which meant that there's now this large treasury that this community is in charge of, which makes new people want to cut. So then a lot of interesting stuff gets funded, right? And that makes new people want to come in and be part of that because there's something real going on here. And so the nouns is, probably the single most salient example of this, but there are, of course, lots of others, right? And nouns, for example, they've released basically the whole governance tooling of nouns, so you can kind of fork it and do whatever you want with it. And there's lots of interesting stuff being built on top of nouns. So it's a great example of this. The last one is the broadest motivation, and I would say is the closest to the history of corporate governance. Okay, and this is this idea that by having something governed by the people who've invested in it, by having something governed by the people who are contributing to it, you're creating what we in social science would call credible commitments. You're able to promise that in the future, this project is going to make decisions consistent with the interests of the people who are empowered to be part of its governance. And that can be very valuable. Think about what's going on with Apple today, right? Where some developers now are reluctant to start putting in a lot of effort to make something new for the App Store. Obviously, people are still doing it. It's necessary. But people on the margin are reluctant because they don't know what's going to happen in the future. Are the rules going to change so my app's not allowed anymore? Are the fees going to go up? Am I going to be allowed to process payments the way I want to, and so forth? On the margin, those are all kind of bad features for long-term innovation in a market. And if you can create instead a model where you say, decisions we make in the future about how this thing works, about the rules, about who's allowed to develop on this thing, about how fees are, those are going to be made through a process that includes all of you. You're going to be part of the decision. That's a way to create what we call a credible commitment. That's a way for you to trust now that 5 years from now, your interests are still going to be aligned with this protocol. And so that's potentially very powerful if you set it up right and things go well, right? It's still obviously hard. And so you have to decide, who are the stakeholders who I need to be part of this governance system so that they feel like in the long run their interests are being represented. And then you have to decide how to represent their interests. And I just want to give you 2 examples of this. and then I'll wrap up with some more concrete discussions of like how to actually do all these things in practice. So 2 really great examples that are top of mind for me, and 2 projects where I've been spending a lot of my time studying lately. One is Lido, which I believe is now larger than Maker. So it's huge TVL, kind of new from a DAO perspective. Right? So it's sort of like plugging into proof of stake on Ethereum. And people are worried, and have been for some time now since Ethereum, since the merge, that Lido has become too big, right? In the sense that too large of a fraction of all the staking in Ethereum is going through this intermediate protocol. That people are worried about that. And then it's creating, it's not really all the way to a single point of failure, but there's a concern that there's like a concentrated risk with Lido. And so that's a problem for Lido. Obviously, it's a problem for the community if it's true. If some people debate whether it's true or not. I don't know enough to make any claims there. But the fact that it could be true, or that people believe it could be true, is itself a problem. Not only for the community at large, but for Lido specifically, because Lido wants to exist into the future and succeed. And if people don't trust it, then that's bad for it. So how can they use governance to try to solve this problem? It comes back to exactly what I just said. It's about bringing into the governance process the people whose incentives you need to align. And so in particular, what Lido is working on now, and you can go check this out in their forums, it's quite interesting. You can see a post that I wrote there with Porter. What are they trying to do? They're going to try, instead of having just a normal token-based DAO governance model, they're going to take that normal model and they're going to add to it a new veto that can be triggered by people who hold staked ETH, which is the thing Lido issues to people when they lock up their ETH with Lido. And so they're calling it dual governance. It's almost like, in American politics, we might almost call it like bicameralism or divided government or separation of powers. And what's the idea? The idea is that if a bunch of staked ETH people whose interests are to make sure that the proof of stake system continues operating can block decisions that the LDO holders make, then that might assure them in the future that the LDO holders can't do something overly malicious to the Ethereum proof of stake system at large. So it's a way to create trust by bringing in the people who you need to trust you directly into your governance model. Super, super interesting. There's a lot of design consideration about how you actually make the veto work. So this is not nearly a finished thing, but it's a very, very interesting direction, I think. Okay. The last example I want to talk about is actually a combination of several of these goals. It's both about, I think, building trust and also getting people to come into your community, and that's optimism. And so optimism is a layer 2, and what they have thought about, and this is a problem that's been around for a while, it's something Vitalik has been super outspoken about. What's on their mind is this idea that if all decisions that you put to a DAO, all the things that can't be ossified, are done through token voting, then you're really heavily weighting the interests of a pretty small set of large token holders, right? And that can be bad if what you need for your project to succeed in the long run is for there to be kind of a vibrant community of other kinds of participants, like people who contribute to the project, who hang out in the DAO and do stuff for the DAO, who write extra code or build new tools. If those people all have to be whales before they feel like they have a role to play in the project, that can be very bad, both for attracting people and for long run convincing people that if this is going to be a kind of a broad project that's supposed to appeal to a lot of different types of people, that you can succeed in that if all you have is token voting. So what is Optimism doing? They're experimenting with I think there's a whole range of things you can do here. They're experimenting with one very interesting way to do this, which is that they're creating another kind of bicameralism. So Lido is building in this veto to try to get staked ETH holders to trust them. Optimism is building a whole decision-making apparatus for major contributors to the community. And the way you become a member of this body is not by holding lots of tokens, it's by creating a track record of having contributed and participated in the community. And there's a super interesting and thoughtful process they've built out for how they decide who meets those criteria. And then once you're in this body, you're part of a group that gets to decide on how certain kinds of treasury funds are used in a kind of to support public goods for the project at large. So it's a really interesting way of trying to move beyond pure token voting and bring in these other stakeholders who are important and try to get them to be part of the process. You know, I would say the challenges to it are going to be kind of what I alluded to before. Can you get these people to consistently participate? Can you create a fair process for choosing who they are? And can you give them enough powers so that it's not lip service, so that they are really meaningfully making collective decisions that people care about? I think those are always like fundamental questions about these things. Okay, let me wrap up with some thoughts on like, those are the overarching goals and considerations. And now there's sort of like, well, how do you actually put this into practice? And oftentimes when I talk to projects, they're in this phase of sketching out. Sometimes they call it a constitution, you know, other times it's like a Medium post or doesn't quite feel as lofty as a constitution, but it's probably a reasonable way to do it. They're in the process of writing out their governance structure so that they can explain it to the community and get people's buy-in. So how should you actually do that? What should you think about? I think there's probably a lot of things that should go into that, and I won't claim to know anywhere close to everything you should know to do that well. But here are, I think, 4 like key questions for your constitution. The first is scope. What are the decisions that the governance process is going to make? And so if we think back to what I was talking about in terms of goals, right? You may want there to be almost no governance because you're going to lock as much as you can into just the way the protocol is built, right? Or you might have a wide range of decisions that you think need to be made through governance because you're really interested in some of those goals I spoke to earlier that really require buy-in and require a bunch of people to believe the stakes are high and so forth. So you see a wide range of projects. So I would put Maker, for example, pretty far in terms of scope. A lot of stuff is decided through governance. I would put Uniswap farther to the other side. Fewer things are decided by governance, though as we know this week, more than nothing is certainly decided by governance. So that's a big one. When you think about how you're going to design your governance system and you've identified your goals in your mind, like I know what I want governance to achieve, then that should help you then specify, here are the things that are going to be decided by governance. The second thing, which also relates back to those goals, is who? Who gets to decide? How are you distributing out your voting power? How are you, giving out the tokens, but also if you're going beyond token voting, how are you doing the other things like that? That's obviously crucial. One thing I haven't talked about at all yet, which is where I actually spend a lot of my time, is this third category, the rules. Okay, so you've decided these big questions about what governance is going to do and who's going to do it, but how are they actually going to do it? And there's a bunch of considerations here about how do you implement voting and so forth that I can talk about a little bit. And then finally, there's the timeline. When are you going to push out this governance power? And there's some pros and cons to different ways of doing that. Okay, I'm going to talk for about 5 more minutes. Is that about right? Okay. Okay, so let me take each of these briefly in turn, and then I'm going to conclude. How much do you want governance to do? As I said, there's a bunch of trade-offs and considerations. There's obviously no one right answer. If you take one thing away from at least my view on all this stuff is that there is no one governance model that works for everyone. It's completely context dependent. So less governance. Try to push as much stuff as you can just into the way the thing is designed, built, and used. Leave as little as possible for collective decisions through voting and other types of governance. What does that do? Obviously, the fewer things you have to decide through voting, the faster you can go. Voting is just slow. If you've ever spent any time on DAOs, you got to walk the halls. That's what we call it in academia. That's where you go around and tell everyone about your proposal, and then you hear that it's terrible and you change it. That can take months, to say nothing of how long it takes in academia. It's obviously faster if you're doing as little as possible by voting, right? So if you want to make a ton of decisions quickly, you don't want to be using voting a lot, okay? Likewise, if you're the founder of a project, it is very likely that you know more than anyone else in the world about what the right decisions are for that project to make. So why would you want to give over those decisions to people who might not know as much, right? So that's another argument for you're going to lower the risk of bad decisions or increase the probability of good decisions for at least some domain of decisions where your experience and expertise is especially relevant, okay? And you're also going to have less conflict, maybe. That's actually a little bit debatable, but like you're not going to have the kind of collective conflict that is kind of the bread and butter of democracy. But the other side of that coin, right, is by keeping it not very democratically governed, you're getting less of that buy-in from people who are excited to participate. You're getting less of that sense of trust. You have maybe a less good story for users. You have a less good story for your censorship resistance, potentially, depending. And maybe most problematically for all those things, there may actually be a bunch of collective decisions that are still being made, but they're being made in a kind of hidden way where you don't realize it. Right? Okay, and so those are some of the downsides. Now, you can go over here, and you can have tons of governance. Leave lots of decisions up to this governance process. That could be good for that buy-in and trust I was talking about. It might bring users in. It makes the process very explicit and transparent. This is how we make these decisions. You're going to see the whole thing. But it's slow. It could lead to bad decisions, whether because people just don't know what they're doing. They're like speculating more than you would be if you made the decision. Or because someone with a defined, interest comes in and captures the process. So imagine a a bad case scenario where someone comes to your DAO and says, I have this great consulting project. You just pay me $5 million and I'll do a great job, doing whatever for your DAO. And I'm gonna buy $1 million of tokens to vote in favor of awarding me $5 million for this contract. Or stuff like that happens. That's a classic case of a concentrated interest group capturing a process, and that's more likely to happen in a world where not very many people are participating. So there's like pros and cons here to anywhere on the spectrum. It's a trade-off. There's no right answer. It depends what you're trying to do. Okay, who gets to decide? Classic bread and butter political science question. You can, it used to be early on, my impression, right, that it was common to hold a lot of the tokens for yourself. Now, over time, that's becoming less common. Why? For a lot of reasons. But a major one is that as people pay more attention, that seems less fair. And it leaves the rest of the people you need to buy into your project feeling like, why should I buy into this? I'm not really part of this. Right? And so over time, I would say, at least for the kind of like very high profile, most exciting projects, there's been a lot of work to like figure out fairer ways to distribute voting power. That could take the form of tokens, but as I said before, it could also take the form of going beyond token voting and using some of these other tricks like identifying people who've contributed a lot and giving them like a non-transferable token that allows them to vote, things like that. Again, there's like a trade-off here, right? There's something very elegant and simple to the pure token voting model. It's like shareholder voting in the corporate world. It concentrates voting power with people who have the most at stake, who might have the most information about the decision being made. But on the other hand, it feels less fair and less representative of a broader group of people who you might want to be included in your process. So there's, again, like potentially big trade-offs there. Okay, the rules. I could have given a whole talk just about the rules, but I actually think the voting rules are one of the less important parts of DAO governance. When I got into this space, I thought it would be all voting rules, because that's like what I like to do. But it turns out there's a lot of excitement about implementing different types of voting rules, and it is something that technology enables. But what I've observed is that all these other things I've just talked about, those are the big matzo balls, like in terms of stuff you have to decide. How you vote is less important, I think, most of the time than structuring it so that you're making the right decisions and have the right people voting. Once you have those two things, the outcomes often aren't that strongly a function of the way you vote for reasonable, plausible ways you might vote. Nevertheless, there are some that I think are super valuable. So one thing I talked about earlier, which I also have a piece about that you can check out if you're interested, is this idea that delegation, or liquid democracy as people are sometimes calling it in this space, I like how everything gets rebranded, we would call it representative democracy maybe, that could be a really good idea. And it could be a really good idea for the reasons I described, that we know direct democracy doesn't really work. Shareholder voting also doesn't work very well, and actually it has liquid democracy in it. They call it proxy voting. It's a way more boring name. So that seems like a very smart rule, and I would say over time, more and more of the projects I talk to are using some kind of delegation by default. I think there's a lot more work that can be done to make delegation better and to get more people delegating, but it seems like kind of a table stakes idea at this point. I also mentioned in terms of rules you might want to explore, thinking about directly rewarding for participation through voting. So like imagine you have a new project, you have some kind of native token, you might give people rewards denominated in that native token as part of this like broader effort to incentivize participation, coming back to like the optimism style idea of including those people in governance in different ways. There's a lot of energy around like more complicated ways to total up people's votes. So like quadratic voting is something you might hear about, conviction voting, things like that. I think they all have a place. They're all, if you like go read the academic papers on them, you got to find like what is the objective function being maximized by this idea, and then you got to map that to the goal you have in mind and make sure they're equal, because otherwise it's like they're not multi-purpose tools, right? They're all optimized for some, welfare function. I'm a bit of a skeptic that any of those are like first order priorities for projects. When I hang out with them, it's much harder to figure out like how are we going to get people to vote at all? Like what are they going to decide on? How do we make these decisions well? More than like, is the problem that we need to reflect intensity of preference in the voting tool that we use? So that's kind of my view on this, but I think it is interesting that there are all these options now. Finally, this is my last slide basically, on the timeline here, there's like a trade-off here. This is a graphic I borrowed with citation from an interesting blog post on this. You often see the following sequence, which is depicted here, which is like first you spend all of your time figuring out what your project does. Like why should people want to use it? What is its utility? After you find that, people start to use it and pay attention to it or interested in it, then you start to kind of like bootstrap a community around it. And ideally, for some projects at least, that's organic. People are psyched about this tool, and so they show up and they want to create a community. Because then this parallels physical world history too. Like it's a lot easier to build community and democracy organically than to try to like top-down plan it. It's not impossible to build top-down states like it's been done, but it's a lot harder. And so if you can have this organic creation of a community, that's very helpful. And then in the kind of the third phase here is you can start that process of progressive decentralization where this naturally growing community takes on more and more formal powers over time. So that's a sequence you'll often see with a lot of projects where when they're new, they're talking about governance, they're exploring it, but they're not really using it yet. And I just want to flag, that can be very, very smart. I mean, it's just logical, but also can be very, very smart because if you go too big too fast, you face this very unpleasant asymmetry, which is that if you give out power, you can't really take it back, especially in the blockchain context, right? And so this is, for example, is a theme, just to go back to my Lido example. Imagine you're going to give out a veto to the staked ETH holders. And one of the things you have to decide when you give out a veto is like, what's the threshold for the veto to be triggered? And imagine you set the veto as any one staked ETH voting is a veto, and you implement that. You've basically now risked permanently thrashing the whole project, right? Because now any one staked ETH can veto anything you want to do, and you can't undo it because the decision to undo that rule would itself be vetoable. And so you want to be really careful when you roll out new governance powers. And this is exactly what happens in the real world. Like back when parliaments were taking on new powers, this was exactly the concern. Like, from the perspective of these sort of like elites or whatever you want to call them, was like, how much power do we want to give out? And will it be, if it goes really badly, can we pull it back? Like, no. And so this like progressive rolling out of governance makes a lot of sense. However, there is a downside, right? Which is if you think the governance is critical to those things I talked about before, like if your project is of the form where, for example, like telling people right up front that they're going to be part of the decision-making process is part of the service, is part of what you're offering, then obviously you can't wait. Like you need the governance on day one. So it really depends again on your use case. Okay, that's what I have for you today. Happy to stop here and take questions. I'll just flag, this is my concluding slide for you. There's a ton I obviously haven't talked about. And so like if you actually are I tried to give you kind of like the conceptual things that I think are worth thinking about, the questions you might ask yourself, the trade-offs involved. There's a lot of like nuts and bolts thing that I didn't touch on, many of which I'm not even expert on, obviously. So you build out governance. Obviously, you want to like get people to audit your code. You want to draw from existing governance smart contracts where you can, presumably. There's a bunch of best practices you want to get familiar with so that you don't like have these super embarrassing governance attacks that still happen in new projects sometimes when they don't follow best practices. Just like an example of that would be like, you don't want to create a system where it's possible to like take out a flash loan for 51% of your voting power, vote with it, and then give the flash loan back. So stuff like that. There's also like a pretty broad set of services that can help you like get your message board going, like get people participating and stuff. So that's the kind of thing you want to think about. And the last is just like what I observe with successful projects is like they're walking the halls, as I said, like they're going to all the people who are involved and coordinating with them, making sure that like if a proposal's coming up that everyone knows about it and so forth. And that's the kind of like soft governance stuff you want to think about as well. So I will stop there. Happy to field some questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. I have one quick question going all the way back to your talk, which you mentioned, we have this new technology, we're repeating a lot of the experimentation and mistakes we had before, but, it must be going somewhere new. Where do you think that somewhere new is, and why do you think that?
It's a good question. I think there's a couple new parts to it that I'm particularly excited about. One is this idea that like large online platforms now play a role in our society that's almost like quasi-governmental in some of the decisions that they're making. And because they like span the globe, and because they like have these very particular use cases that policymakers aren't that familiar with, we need some other way to like govern them. And so I think these tools provide a plausible path, I think, to a future where like very large online platforms are not governed entirely by like one executive or one board of directors, but rather by some combination of, I think realistically there probably should always be executives in like a corporation, but they could also have users, developers, sellers, creators, whatever, as part of the governance process. And you really need something like blockchain technology, I think, to make that credible, to create those credible commitments that's like, I'm going to give you voting power on like, this social media platform, and I'm not going to be able to take it away from you. So that's one very broad domain I'm super excited about. In terms of more specifically like on the kind of like the governance tools themselves, one of the things I think is that I didn't realize, it took me like a year of working in this space before I realized this really came from the Lido stuff. This idea that you can create a governance system with these additional rules or constraints on what decisions can be made beyond the 51% voting for it. So the idea that you could hard code in a veto, let's say. I think that potentially opens up a pretty wide space of like legislative design that we don't have access to in the real world. So in the real world, think about the US. The US has this filibuster thing, which is something other than a 51% voting rule. And it is stuck for a while now because both parties make this calculation that like, if I get rid of this, which I'm perfectly free to do, like you can just instantly get rid of it if you're in the majority. You can just vote and say like, we don't want that anymore. Why don't they do that? Well, they kind of are now over time. They're like chipping away at it. Why don't they just go all the way and get rid of it? It's because they're worried that that's going to create some kind of repeat tit for tat where then when the other party's in charge, something even worse is going to happen. And so it sustains for a little while. But those kind of rules don't sustain in the long run because at any point there's this idea called remote majoritarianism, which is that like 51% of legislators could always vote to change anything because it's the only reversion point. It's like the one thing we can all agree on is that a majority rules. Everything else that's built on top of that is inherently fragile. Like a majority could always decide to undo it by just voting to undo it. And blockchain and DAOs is the first thing I have ever seen where like you could hard code in some other rule and the majority can't undo it, at least in the same way. Like you'd have to, fork and stuff, and that might not work. And so that I think it creates a whole set of commitments that aren't possible in legislatures that could be quite valuable, though I don't know where yet. And then the last thing I'll say is kind of like just softer, but like just this ability for like anonymous groups across the world to freely enter and exit and like quickly make decisions or not make decisions. I think that will be a very natural extension of like what we see in corporate governance today. And you could imagine like some kind of interesting global entities of the future that like are governed that way, which wouldn't be possible in corporations today. Yeah.
One more question.
I can try to squeeze you into it.
Cool. Yeah, thanks a lot. So I had a question. You said in the beginning that DAOs are very novel because they draw on blockchain technology. And I think one of the other things that is very novel about them is that they don't really are situated in any particular country or governance or anything like this. So I was wondering if you could expand a bit on like what of the properties of DAOs come from that fact that they basically are not backed by institutions and they can't draw on like legal systems for kind of like governance.
Yeah. I don't know. I think I've definitely thought about that a lot. I would say probably relative maybe to most people here or relative to the community, I'm like more pragmatist than most people. And so I think eventually they will be integrated into the legal system. We do have lots of historical examples of like weird new things that cut across global jurisdictions. The internet was this way, and they just kind of like figured it out. It took a long time. The history of that stuff, I think, would be super interesting. Like, if you have an experience, like, take a look. I have this theory that, like, the history of eBay kind of explains, like, everything that happens online, because eBay has lived through, like, all of this stuff. And so, like, oh, you think, like, Facebook was the first company ever to face these, like, content moderation controversies. It's like, nope. In the early 90s, people were selling Nazi memorabilia on eBay. And in France, it's illegal to do that, and they got sued, and it came to this exact question of like, well, this is a global company. What country do we even sue it in? And they just kind of like figured it out over time and kind of muddled through. And so my view is in the future they will somehow figure it out, and there'll be layers to this. So there will be a layer of like, hopefully somewhat sensible laws and policies that sort of hash those things out. And then on top of that can be these very interesting global entities. I'm not a lawyer. I have no idea how they'll deal with it. But like long term, one of my views on global governments is that they're like really good at figuring stuff out when it like affects their bottom line. And I just think long run, they're like, this is why this is a long answer to your question, but why I'm a complete pessimist on this like network state type stuff is like governments have the weapons, like they're in charge. And I think they will be for a really long time. Probably for the best also, in my personal view. But yeah, that's a long answer to your question.
Thank you.
I'll hang for a couple of minutes after. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.